Right, this is part two of the Fianna Fáil discussion from 1932 to 39, and in this session I'm going to focus specifically on the whole area Anglo-Irish relations. This is a massively important question. Anglo-Irish relations is the most commonly asked question in this section, and it comes up quite often. In the event it doesn't come up, you can also, of course, use it for a question on, for example, the strengths and weaknesses of Eamon de Valera as a leader, or a general question on Fianna Fáil in this period, which, by the way, has never been asked. The only thing I'm not going to focus on here is the economic war, which I will deal with in the economic and social policy section in the next video. But we're going to be looking at the dismantling of the treaty, which came about basically after the Statute of Westminster of 1931. De Valera came in as Taoiseach a few months later, and he was then basically going to rip up the rule book using the Statute of Westminster. This was a bill passed by the Commonwealth states, whereby all previous laws passed by Westminster could now be repealed or amended. And that basically gave De Valera a carte blanche to kind of revisit the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 and essentially systematically eliminate all these different components of it. So you could start off here with a question and focus just on the Oath of Allegiance, okay? Chronologically, it probably makes sense. And it was also De Valera's main aim as well when he became Taoiseach or President of the Executive Council to abolish this. It was one of the root causes of the Civil War itself, and De Valera felt it was a major burden hanging over Irish politics and in the way of improving relations. So, under the Constitutional Amendment Bill, or the removal of the Oath Bill of 1933, he basically took it out. This was the oath that all TDs had to take, pledging allegiance to His Royal or Her Royal Majesty in Britain as head of state, and that was simply a major thing for De Valera and others, especially the anti-treaty people, members of Fianna Fáil, etc., who refused to take this for many, many years. When it was passed through the Dáil, the Senate, as it was called then, delayed it up to 2 years. The Senate was a kind of the old upper house. This is pre-Seanad 1937, and there would have been quite a lot of kind of conservative, kind of, I suppose, West Brit elements in the Seanad, or the Senate, I should say, and De Valera would eventually abolish the Senate. It was greeted by some opposition as well from the British, who were kind of caught unawares by this tactic. They didn't expect this guy De Valera to come in so many months after the statute was passed, but he legally, I suppose, and constitutionally kind of had them on this, and the oath was pretty much removed by 1933. The next area of discussion then would be the Governor General. This was the King's representative in Ireland. This was the symbolic head of state, if you will, and the King had been our head of state under the terms of the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty, and De Valera sought to remove it as best he could. Now, the Governor-General as such could be appointed by the Irish government of the day, and indeed fired by the Irish government of the day. He could be a commoner, he could be a Catholic, and the first Governor-General, I think, was a guy called Tim Healy, and he was succeeded by James MacNeill under the Cumann Gael Cosgrave government. He'd been in there since 1920. And it was nothing personal as such against MacNeill, but De Valera sought to reduce the importance of the position and of the role by simply ignoring the office of the Governor-General and essentially blanking it at state functions, consultation with the Governor-General, etc. So this was becoming a bit of a problem for the British, and De Valera, within his remit as President of the Executive Council, essentially dismissed MacNeill and appointed his charge, a guy called Donal Ó Buachla. Now, Ó Buachla himself was kind of in on the joke, so to speak, and he was happy to make a mockery of the office, so much so that he moved out of the Viceregal Lodge in Phoenix Park, which today we call the Áras Nuachtaráin, and instead he moved into a council house in Dublin. He also did away with the trappings of the job, we'd say like the chauffeured car, and instead cycled around Dublin in on a bike. Okay, so you really are making a bit of a mockery of the position then when you do that. So with that, the kind of fizzles out, for want of a better word, in about 1933, actually abolished then under the 1937 new constitution. Okay, and again, this would have kind of raised a few eyebrows in British circles, but there was nothing they could really do about it because De Valera had paid a MasterCard here and had pretty much, seen off the position of. Another area that might be worth looking at that some students perhaps tend to ignore at times is the whole role of the Privy Council. What was the Privy Council? It was essentially the last court of appeal. Okay, in the Irish court system, you had your courts, you had your High Court, you had your Supreme Court, but laws passed, etc., could be challenged in a British judiciary called the Privy Council. And this was something that was kind of hanging over the Irish judicial system. And De Valera felt that if he wanted to have full independence from Britain, not just economically or politically, but also in a legal sense, that this job would have to be done. And therefore, abolition of the Privy Council was the thing to be done. Again, he plays a master card on this. He kind of says it to the British Privy Council themselves look at the situation, and they also have to look at the Statute of Westminster and what it said. Actually, it pretty much ruled in De Valera's favour, and they voted themselves out of existence in relation to the Irish Free State, because under the Statute of Westminster, it could be abolished, and the role of Privy Council in the Irish Free State was no more as a result. So this was a major coup by De Valera in his role of dismantling the treaty. He also eventually would remove the Senate. Okay, the Senate was, I suppose, it's not really Anglo-Irish policy, but it had been slowing things up by two years or so. And eventually, by 1937, the Senate is abolished and a new refined Seanad is established, which would very much be kind of more pro-government of the day, because the Taoiseach of the day could then pick a certain amount of senators who would always pretty much vote along with him. So the Seanad came into formulation in 1937 after the Senate itself was abolished, caused major alarms over his decision to marry an American divorcee. De Valera kind of swooped in then with the abdication in December of that and passed called the External Relations Act, which pretty much changes the constitution and essentially removes all reference to the king in the Irish constitution, and also it kind of further distances of us from that the two acts would greatly change the relationship. The Constitutional Amendment Act said it would delete from the Constitution all mention of the King and of the representative of the Crown, whether that under the title or under the title of Governor General. So essentially you abolish the Governor General formally with this external act. It also would provide for an existence of diplomatic relationships between the two countries, but it essentially removed the king as a constitutional organ as such from the Irish Free State. And that then very much paves the way for a new constitution called Bunreacht na hÉireann, which comes about in 1937. The constitution itself, again, you could put this in if it was a question on Anglo-Irish relations, you could make reference to it, or something on specifically De Valera's Anglo-Irish relations. You might want to elaborate on this a bit more. But the constitution came into being in 1937, in December 29th of that year, with a slight enough majority voting in favour of it, 685,000 plus against 526,000 against. But the differences in the constitution was that the Irish Free State would now cease to be known as that, and instead it would be known as ERA. And it would be known as ERA from 1937 up until 1949, when it becomes the Republic of Ireland. Articles 2 and 3 would claim that Ireland was the island of Ireland, which was the entire 32 county span of territories and airspace and sea, and that would prove quite controversial for Unionists up in the north, and would not be abolished until after the Good Friday Agreement was passed in 1998. So that claim to the island of Ireland no longer exists. The head of state would no longer be the king, but would now be Uachtaráin na hÉireann, which we call today the president, and that would be elected by a popular vote every 7 years or thereabouts. And the government would now be led by the Taoiseach, replacing the title of a president of the Executive Council. So that's the first time we use the word Taoiseach as such. The Irish Parliament, the Oireachtas, would be composed of two houses, the Dáil, which was the elected TDs in the lower house, and the newly refined Seanad, replacing the old Senate, which, as I mentioned earlier on, had lesser powers, and the Taoiseach had greater influence on the election of senators and nomination of senators body. Other areas as well, briefly mentioning the reference to the Catholic Church. It wasn't the official state religion. In fact, there was no official state religion, but the role of Archbishop John Charles McQuaid and the influence was there, and that the Catholic Church had a special standing in Irish life. And for many, this would be perhaps De Valera's longest lasting legacy, as it still is there today, albeit amended numerous times in the year. There you can see a picture of De Valera and Chief Justice O'Sullivan and Frank Fahey on the day the Constitution came into force. Okay, so I think we're going to leave that there for a moment. I should also point out, if you're doing a question on Anglo-Irish relations, the economic war is very much part of that question, but I will deal with that in the economic section in the next video. So the economic war works for both a question on society and economy and Anglo-Irish relations, and indeed a question on De Valera himself or Fianna Fáil from this period itself. Okay, so video number 3 will be dealing with society and economy.